Hello everyone, this is another one of my Google Slides presentations that we've had to convert into a YouTube video, so you don't need to turn the sound on or put it in present mode. Also, please remember that the links are not going to work within the pages, so where it says you can click tundra to jump to the tundra or click rainforest to jump to the rainforest, you would have to actually just scroll through the video if you wanted to skip sections. One plus side to changing this into a YouTube is that I have been able to add a link to the PDF for the activity that's at the end of the video if you would like to do that activity and you don't want to keep pausing through the video to see the activity sheet. So you can just click the link down in the description and it will take you to the PDF of that activity. So I guess let's give this another shot. This Google Slides presentation is going to focus on plant adaptations. Now, a lot of people don't think that plants have adaptations, but if you really think about the plants around you, they do have some really interesting and neat things about them, and that's what we're going to be looking at today, is different plant adaptations. Our learning objective for today is, I can identify adaptations of plants. We will start out with a key definition. What is a plant adaptation? A plant adaptation is a trait that helps the plant survive. Just like an animal adaptation was something about the animal that helped the animal to survive, a plant adaptation is just something about the plant that helps the plant survive. Most plant adaptations are based on the type of ecosystem that the plant actually lives in. So we have different adaptations depending on the different ecosystems. So on this page you can see a map, and I've highlighted some of the major ecosystems that have pretty severe plant adaptations. There are other ecosystems that aren't on here and other plant adaptations that we won't talk about today. But again, just like with the animal adaptations we talked about in the last slideshow, there's way too many to discuss in one setting. Also, each of these black boxes on this page is a hyperlink that will take you to that section of the slideshow. So if you don't have time to do all of them in one day, or you only want to look at the desert adaptations, you can just poke on the word desert or click on the word desert with your mouse, and it will take you to that section of the Google slideshow. We're going to start in the tundra ecosystem. In the tundra ecosystem, it is very, very cold pretty much year-round, and there's a layer of permafrost or permanently frozen layer under the soil, so that causes some issues for plants. So the adaptations we're going to be talking about first have to do with plants that live in the cold tundra ecosystem. So the first adaptation we're going to talk about is the fact that tundra plants are typically smaller, shorter plants, and they're normally low to the ground. And the reason that they're low to the ground is to protect them against the harsh winds that are often found in the tundra ecosystem. We can see in this picture here that there really aren't many tall trees. There are different plants in the picture, but all of them are pretty much short, stubby little plants. Another adaptation that is typical for a tundra plant is that if they're flowering plants, they typically have dark flowers to absorb as much heat and light from the sun as possible. There are some plants that have light-colored flowers too, but most of the flowers that you're going to find are going to be darker in color, like these purple ones that we see in the picture here. Tundra plants typically grow in clusters or clumps, and this helps protect the plants from the winds, but it also allows them to trap more heat. If there's a group of them, they can get the heat trapped there. So you can see the little cluster of flowers here that it's growing. They would grow in little groups or clusters like this among the rocks and the soil. Another unique adaptation of tundra plants is that some of the tundra plants have fuzzy stems, which are an adaptation to help keep the plant from freezing in the extreme temperatures and the winds of the tundra. Many of the tundra plants have red leaves or very dark green leaves, and the dark colored leaves allow the plant to absorb more sunlight. The last adaptation that we're going to discuss for plants that are in the tundra regions are the fact that a lot of them have shallow roots. The shallow roots are because there's a layer of soil that's permanently frozen called permafrost if you go down very deep at all. And so the shallow roots allow the plants to take advantage of the soil that's right on top that's not frozen. It also allows them to get the water that they might need from any melting snow. So they're not going to be able to have roots that go down very deep because of the permanently frozen soil or permafrost that's there. The next ecosystem that we're going to discuss adaptations for is the tropical rainforest. Now, I have to remember that in a tropical rainforest ecosystem, it's basically warm and wet all year long. Maybe even more like hot and wet all year long. So these plants have to have adaptations to deal with that amount of moisture that happens in the tropical rainforest. Many of the plants in the tropical rainforest, especially the ones that are closer to the forest floor, have large leaves. The large leaves allow the plant to collect as much sunlight as possible. Now, this is important because the plants are using that sunlight to do photosynthesis and make their food. So if they can't get enough sunlight, they can't make enough food to survive. The picture here that we have, this is a atypically extremely large leaf. They're not all quite this big, but I did think that this photo was interesting to show you how big the leaves can get along that forest floor in the rainforest. And speaking of leaves, because of the large amounts of rainfall, many plants in the rainforest also have drip tips or points at the end of their leaves to help channel the water away from the roots of the plant to prevent mold due to too much moisture. So I took that same picture that we had in the last slide because it also has a really good example of a drip tip leaf where the water would slide down the leaf and come off the point away from the roots of the plant so that so much water doesn't collect. They kind of act like a little canopy around the base of the plant to protect it from getting too wet and growing mold. A lot of the trees in the rainforest actually have slippery bark. And so this would be to allow the rain to slide down the trunk of the tree, as opposed to the bark that we see out on our trees where it's a very woody bark and it has lots of cracks and crevices that could collect all of the rain. These trees, there's too much rain, there's a lot of rain, and so they want that rain to slide off and away from the tree, and so they have slippery bark. Many of the plants in the tropical rainforest also have shallow roots. The reason for this is the soil in the rainforest is often not great soil. It's got poor quality, low nutrient levels. And so if the roots are shallow up toward the surface of the soil, any new nutrients that are coming from decaying plants or animals, the roots are right there to be able to get those nutrients. There's also other types of roots that are like a buttress root or a prop root that would help the trees be able to stand up because the soil is wet and so the roots don't go down deep. So like in this picture, these are actually called buttress roots. And so they're up on the ground and they're more like a support system for the tree to help it stand up. So the last plant adaptation that I want to talk about for the rainforest is the fact that the rainforest grows in layers. And the plants that are in each layer are adapted to the amount of resources available. Specifically, we're talking about the amount of sun or the amount of water that they would be dealing with. So at the very top, emerging out of all of the other trees, you have the emergent layer. The top layer of trees that's pretty much like a covering is called the canopy layer. Underneath that, we have the understory, and then we have the forest floor. So there's different levels to the rainforest because of the different amounts of resources that are there. Those trees that are up in that emergent layer, that canopy layer, they're not going to have as large of leaves as the trees that are down in the forest floor because the sunlight's more available up top. Okay, the reason for those leaves was so they could collect more sunlight, so the ones at the top don't need those big leaves. So the adaptations for these plants change depending on which layer of the rainforest they happen to be located in. The next set of adaptations for plants that I want to discuss belong to the plants that are found in the grasslands. Some people get confused about grasslands because we think about grasslands here as in like the prairies, and we think of grasslands like in Africa as in the savanna. Those are actually both grasslands, they just happen to be slightly different in type. The adaptations I'm going to talk about today, though, actually could be applicable to either of the two types of grasslands. A lot of the plants, especially the grasses that are in the grasslands, are going to have really deep roots. This allows them to grow back after the grazers bite off the tops, and it also allows the plant to grow back if there happens to be a fire. Fire is one of the problems that they tend to see in grassland areas, and so with that deep of a root, the entire plant doesn't burn, it's just the surface layer. So just like when an animal bites the top off, if the top is burnt off in a grass fire, the plant is able to grow back. So I thought it was really interesting to see the height of the grass and the length of the roots that you can see in the picture that I added to this slide. The next adaptation for grassland plants that I want to discuss is that most of them are going to have a flexible stem. The flexible stem allows them to bend and sway in the wind. There's not a lot of trees, there's not a lot of things that are protective, and these are a lot of times taller grasses and plants that are able to bend and sway as the wind is blowing. So just like the grasses that are here, these are actually savanna grasses. You can see that the stems are very thin and they're more of a green stem. They don't have bark on them so that they're able to bend and sway with the wind. The last grassland plant adaptation that I would like to discuss is that many of these plants, or most of these plants, actually have narrow leaves. So narrow leaves are an adaptation that lessens the amount of water lost through the leaves through the process of transpiration, which puts the water back into the atmosphere as part of the water cycle. So if you have a really big leaf, then there's more surface area for the water to come out of the leaf. And if you have a narrow leaf, then there's not as much place for the water to leave the leaf. So a lot of these either don't have leaves or they have very, very narrow leaves in order to help prevent water loss. The fourth ecosystem that we're going to discuss plant adaptations for would be the aquatic ecosystem. And again, we have freshwater ecosystems and we have marine or saltwater ecosystems, but the adaptations that I'm going to discuss for these plants that live in water are going to be applicable to both of these types of ecosystems. So aquatic plants have more air pockets in their stems and leaves, and some even in their roots, that help the plant straighten and float in the water. If it was just regular grass that was in the water, it wouldn't stand up the way that we see a lot of aquatic plants doing. They may be rooted into the gravel or into the soil at the bottom, and then the plant itself is actually vertically standing up. That's because there are air pockets within that stem that allow it to stand up more in the water. So those air spaces are really important to help these plants that are aquatic plants. Floating roots are a really interesting adaptation. In some aquatic plants, the roots don't need to be in soil. Instead, they form a floating root system, which sometimes tangles into a ball. Sometimes it's not a ball and the roots are just hanging, but oftentimes debris and other things get caught up into it and it ends up looking more like a mass or a ball. But a lot of kids think that plants have to have soil in order to survive, and in aquatic plants, that's not always the case because some of them are not rooted down, they're actually the entire plant is floating. Waxy leaves are an adaptation that we're going to see in multiple ecosystems, but the purpose is different for different ecosystems. So in the aquatic ecosystem, oftentimes the plants are going to have a waxy coating, and that prevents the leaves from rotting because they're sitting in water all day long. So in this case, we're trying to keep too much water out of the leaf by having that waxy coating. Our next adaptation is floating seeds. The seeds of most aquatic plants have the ability to float so that they can be spread around. So these seeds that I have a picture of on this page actually end up making these lotus flowers that go with the lily pads underneath them, and they're floating seeds. So once they come out of the flower, they're able to float to a new location so that they can start to sprout, and there'll be more water lilies in other places. So basically they float for seed dispersal, or the ability to move the seeds to new locations. Our last adaptation for the aquatic ecosystem plants is that the stems on aquatic plants must be adapted to move with the water currents. A flexible stem allows the plant to sway with the water. So just like in the prior ecosystem, the grasslands, the plants had to be able to bend in the wind. The same thing, except now we need to be able to bend in the water. So they have those thinner green stems that are able to bend as the water sways them back and forth. So our next ecosystem would be the taiga, and we're going to talk about adaptations that the plants in the taiga have to have in order to survive the cooler temperatures and the large amounts of snow that are often common in the taiga. So many of the plants in the taiga are called conifers, and they make cones instead of flowers to hold their seeds. In this case, the pollen would be traveling through the winds, and it would get caught up and collected into the cones, and the seeds are fertilized, and that's how the plant is able to reproduce. So when they're ready to lose their seeds, those cones actually open up a little bit, and you can see what the seeds look like in the picture that's here on this page. So the pine cones that we're kicking around out on the playground that we see oftentimes in our yards or in parking lots, those are actually so that the tree can reproduce. Those are where the seeds for that tree would have been located. Another adaptation for many of the plants in the taiga is that they have needles instead of leaves. The needles prevent water loss. So just like our plants in the grasslands that had narrow leaves, now we're moving to where they don't even actually have for real leaves, they have needles instead of leaves. The needles serve the same purpose as the leaf. They're able to collect sunlight for the process of photosynthesis. They're just extremely narrow, so they're not going to lose water like they would if they were a larger leaf. We talked at the beginning of this section about the large amounts of snowfall that often happen in the taiga region. And so a lot of the trees that are there, they have slanted branches. The branches are actually downward sloping, kind of like an upside down V. And the purpose of this is to allow the snow to fall off easier. It prevents the branches from breaking under the weight of all of the snow. So if you think about it, if you had a tree, like a maple tree or something around us that the branches were up and it was collecting snow, and they had the wider leaves that would collect more snow, the snow actually would get very heavy and could break the tree. In this way, by having the slanted down branches, more of the snow is able to fall off and it prevents the tree from breaking. We've seen the waxy coating adaptation before, and it comes back here again in this ecosystem for the same reason that the aquatic plants had it. In the taiga, we're trying to protect the leaves from rotting. Taiga plants have a heavy waxy coating so that the snow that sits on them for long amounts of time doesn't rot the needles that it's sitting on. So just like in the aquatic system where the waxy coating was to keep water out, that's the same reason that some of the trees in the taiga region would have that same waxy coating, is to keep the water out or the snow from rotting the leaves. Lastly, the term evergreen means always green, and the trees in the taiga don't change colors or lose their needles as the seasons change. Instead, they're always green, and so a lot of times you'll see the forests that are in the taiga region referred to as an evergreen forest, and that's simply just because they're always green. They don't change to the pretty reds and yellows and oranges and lose their leaves like deciduous trees. That's a different type of a forest. This would be an evergreen forest or a taiga forest where it's green year-round. And the reason for that is because it lives in an area where the resources are less. There's less sunlight up in the taiga region, and so it needs to be able to collect as much as possible in order to continue to make food for the plant. Our last ecosystem that we're going to discuss plant adaptations for is the desert. Now, the desert plants have so many different adaptations that I'm not even going to be able to cover them all, but I am going to point out some of the more common ones that the plants in the desert would have, and then also some of the interesting ones as well. Keep in mind that we're talking about adaptations that would help a plant live in a place that would be extremely hot, and also that would have very little rainfall. So those are the adaptations that we're going to be looking for. One of the many adaptations desert plants have is their ability to store water in their stem. This allows the plant to gather as much water as it can during the rare rain and use it throughout the dry period. Plants that store water are called succulents, and they don't have to store the water in their stem. They could store it in their leaves. There's a few of them that actually store water in their roots. So as they have the ability to store water, that helps them out whenever they go through a drought or a really dry period. Spines are a really easy adaptation to see. Most cacti are covered in spines instead of leaves. The spines serve several purposes. In the first place, they're great protection for the plant from animals that would like to get to the water that's stored inside of the plant. For the second reason, they reduce water loss. Just like the pine needles that would be on the trees that are in the taiga, instead of leaves, these plants are actually going to have spines, so we're even reducing the water loss even more. And then thirdly, they actually provide shade for the stem. And I know when I first learned that, I was thinking, how in the world is a spine going to provide any shade? But whenever you have a lot of spines together and they kind of start overlapping each other, they actually can provide some shade for the stem of that plant to protect it from the blistering hot sun. So in the desert, we're going to see the waxy coating as an adaptation that comes back again. However, in the desert, it's going to be for a complete opposite purpose as what we've seen it for in the other ecosystems. So cacti have a waxy coating, it's called a cuticle, to prevent water loss from the sun. Water is not able to go through the wax, so it stays in the stem. So here we have plants that are trying to save their water, conserve their water, and keep it in the plant. And since the wax can protect other plants from too much water getting in, it can protect these plants from water getting out. Many plants in the desert can go through a period of dormancy during very harsh conditions. Think of this as like hibernation for plants. The plants are alive, but they're not actually growing. So they don't need as many resources because they're not actually using them to grow. So it's kind of like hibernation, where a bear maybe would go in and sleep for a long period of time and not need food or water. The same thing with the plant. They don't need to be able to carry out their normal functions. In this picture, you can see the same type of a plant. On the left side of the picture, that plant is actually dormant, and on the right side of the picture, the drought is over and the plant has gotten what it needs, and it's come back and grown back its flowers and its small leaves that it uses. So this is an example of dormancy that happens in plants in the desert. Some flowering desert plants open their flowers at night when it's cooler. Because of the extreme temperatures during the day, the pollinating insects are more active at night as well, and that helps the plant with reproduction. So if it was open during the day, the flower could get dried out by the extremely harsh sun, and then there wouldn't be a lot of animals out anyway, or bugs out to do the pollinating. So a lot of the flowering plants that are in the desert, those flowers actually open up at nighttime. Most desert plants have widespread shallow roots. The reason they have shallow roots that are spread out is so that when it does rain, the roots can collect as much water as possible. So water would be the resource that the plants were really competing for in the desert, and so you're not often going to see a lot of plants really close together, and their roots are going to spread out in that space, and so when it rains, there's more roots out close to the surface that can collect as much rainwater as possible. The last adaptation that I want to discuss that's specific to the desert would be their photosynthesis. And photosynthesis itself is true for all plants because all plants are producers. But cacti don't actually have leaves. So photosynthesis in cacti takes place in the stem. Photosynthesis is the process by which the plants produce their own food. They take in sunlight, and then they use water, and they take in carbon dioxide, and they're able to make food for themselves, and also the byproduct of oxygen, which they release into the air for the animals to breathe. So cacti are actually still able to do this, but instead of their leaves, their stem is collecting the sunlight for them. So this last section I had to include because I get questions about these plants all the time in my classes. So in this section, we're going to look at special plant adaptations, which are not necessarily for a specific region, but go more with specific plants. They're not very common. So first up, we have a group of carnivorous plants. These plants are all carnivores. They're meat eaters as well as producers. They're able to trap insects and break them down to get the nutrients. These type plants are typically found in areas where the soil is pretty poor, and so they use those bugs as extra nutrients that they're not getting from the soil. Now, there are about 1,000 species and subspecies of this plant, but we're really talking more about different subspecies. There's not that many of them that are actually able to do this. So if you're looking at the top there, that would be obviously a Venus flytrap. And then underneath to the left, those are pitcher plants. Pitcher plants don't only capture insects. They can actually capture reptiles and small rodents and things as well to break those down. The pitcher there, it's called a pitcher, kind of like you would pour juice out of a pitcher. So it's very tall, and the inside of it is coated with a substance that doesn't allow the animal to climb back out. And then down in the bottom of that is where it's able to dissolve and digest the animal. And then over on the other side, we have a sundew, which is also able to trap insects by curling around them. So all of these plants, they're still producers, but they're also carnivores because they're actually able to get nutrients from other living organisms. On this next slide, we have two different versions of what are sometimes called death flowers. These flowers stink so bad that they smell like death. This attracts flies and beetles, which are their pollinators, and it also wards off predators. So there actually is a purpose to their horrible stench. They've also been called carrion flowers, stinking lilies, or corpse flowers. Sometimes when everything's open, our museum downtown will get one, and they will have it, and people will come and pay extra money to visit it or see it. I'm not sure why. If it smells like death, you would want to be around it, but they are quite large. The second picture there, that's actually considered to be the largest flower in the world. Those are native to Indonesia. And so these are just two different versions of really smelly, stinky death flowers. So the next special plant adaptation is vines, and actually vines are quite common. You can probably find them if you just took a walk around your neighborhood or apartment complex where you are now, but almost all vines have tendrils, and the tendrils are what helps them climb. Tendrils can be leaves or stems, and they've changed in order to help the plant climb toward the sunlight. So in that top picture there, that's a picture of an actual tendril. That's what we mean when we're talking about it. And then you can see the second picture underneath where the vine has climbed up the fence. And you wouldn't be able to just go to the top and take the top of the plant and pull the plant down because it's got those tendrils wrapped all around the different pieces of the fence, several places up as it was growing. So it's actually kind of hard to pull vines down because they're kind of hanging on to things. And the purpose of them growing is just to get closer to the sunlight. So there are lots of other special abilities that plants have. I tried to remember all of the ones that kids generally ask me about. There's 3 more on this page that I don't always get asked about, but that I personally think are pretty cool. So that top little video there, it's called a shame plant, and it folds itself together if you touch it. So each set of leaves that you touch, they'll fold together as a protection for the plant. The bottom left, you can see that's called a sandbox tree, and that's not photoshopped. Those spikes are real. They're actually sticking out of the trunk of that tree all the way to the top, and it's to try to prevent animals from climbing it and eating the fruit that's at the top of the tree. And also about that same sandbox tree, they have fruit at the top, and whenever it's ready to disperse the seeds, it explodes, and it makes an audible sound that's extremely loud, like dynamite. Sometimes it's called a dynamite tree. And so that's another adaptation where the seed dispersal, when it explodes like that, it throws seeds far away from the tree to help that type of a tree spread. And then lastly, I know a lot of us know what water lilies are, but we don't normally get to see these giant water lilies, and they're so big. That's actually a full-grown man standing in the middle of that water lily on the bottom right picture there. So these are just some other plant adaptations that I thought were pretty cool. There are other ones. If there's a specific plant that I didn't talk about that you're curious about, you can shoot me an email at stacypontius@kdisd.org, and I'll try to answer your question. Or, of course, there's Google, which knows way more than I ever could, that you could look it up. I tried to include the ones that I generally get asked about in my classrooms. I think that about sums us up for plant adaptations. I hope that this Google Slides presentation has helped you understand plant adaptations. After this slide, I did include an optional activity. It's called Build a Plant. It's something that I normally do in my classroom for probably normally about 2 days. It takes the kids to finish it. You could do it on your own. Of course, you're not doing it for a grade. If you see the points referenced anywhere in it, that's only points for if I was actually doing it in class grading it, because basically what I did is just try to upload my classroom presentation straight into the back of the slideshow. If you're not interested in doing it, that's okay. It's optional, but it is something that would further help you understand plant adaptations. Thanks for watching. In this optional plant adaptation activity, you're going to need a piece of white paper, some crayons, a pencil, and a die. If you don't have a dice, when it says to roll, you can just pick a number 1 through 6, because actually physically having the die is not important. It's just that you're getting a random number between 1 through 6 each of those times. So after you've gathered your materials, then you can move on through the next slides. This is the last slide that I'm actually going to narrate because the rest of this is just clicking through the actual activity, but I'm going to go ahead and give the directions on this slide. So what you would do is just small in the corner, number your paper 1 through 4, and then you would roll the die 4 times and 4 different numbers. And it doesn't matter 1 through 6. Again, if you don't have a dice, just pick 1 through 6 4 different times, pick a number. After you've done that, then you're going to go to as you click through, it'll show you different roots. And so for number 1, if you rolled an even number, it's a certain type root. And if you rolled an odd number, it's a different type of root. And you would actually sketch that out as the root of your plant, whichever one that you happen to roll. Your second number is for the stem. So again, if it's an even number, it's going to be one type of stem that we discussed. And if it's an odd number, it's going to be the other type of stem that we discussed. And there's pictures on the slides to help you kind of know what you should be drawing. And then number 3 would be the type of leaves that your plant is going to have. And number 4 would be the number that you record is going to be the type of flowers that you actually have. So you're going to sketch out this plant. It's going to look crazy because none of these things go together very well. And then after you've got it all sketched out and drawn, you're going to come up with a name for this plant that you have invented. And then you're going to look at the actual adaptations that it has and decide the ecosystem that plant would be best suited to live in. So after you've actually built the plant, I have more slides that kind of go in depth about what those leaves or what those flowers, like where they would live or why they're adapted the way that they are to kind of help you make your decisions. Now, I've had kids in the past who they said, well, my roots and my stem go with the one ecosystem and my leaves and my flowers go with a different ecosystem. And in that case, they just have to choose and write out their justification. But a lot of they're able to say, well, 3 out of my 4 plant parts would be better adapted for a specific ecosystem, or maybe your whole plant is adapted. Maybe you get random plant parts and none of them go together. All 4 of them are for a different ecosystem. And in that case, you would have to choose, well, where is your plant best going to survive based on the adaptations that it has, and why would that happen? There's no right or wrong answer in all of this. Some of the descriptions definitely lend themselves to be more of a specific ecosystem. But as far as deciding where your plant's going to belong, as long as the kid's able to actually justify it to me, I generally take that answer. So it's just another activity, goes back through some common plant adaptations that we talked about, and then gives you a chance to actually put them together and justify the ecosystem, because the plant adaptations really are more based on where the plant lives in order for that plant to survive. So I hope you enjoyed the activity. My kids normally do. Again, I would explain it better and take more time in a classroom, but given the situation that we have, I've tried to cut and paste a lot of the pieces out of my discussion pieces with the kids as the following slides. Thanks. Remember, if you're having trouble doing this using the YouTube video, I've linked this document into the description underneath the video, so you don't have to, and it's going to flip through this pretty quickly. It'll be hard to read some of the slides that were paper, but if you want to just click that link, it should take you to a PDF of the packet that I give to my kids.